In our democratic republic, a society in which voting and citizen participation in the political process is paramount, there has grown a hypersensitivity among some against anything that even hints of violating the doctrine of separation of church and state. Our founding fathers, many of them non-religious, wrote and spoke highly of religious values as the bulwark of a society, providing the moral foundation that is needed in a democratic republic in order to function and survive, lest it descend over time into chaos and tyranny. However, the modern misinterpretation of this separation has led to an understanding that the first freedom in our Bill of Rights is not a freedom at all, but rather a restraint, a freedom from religion rather than a freedom of religion. Two things have resulted from this misinterpretation. First, the political realm is now seen as a great secular shelter from all things religious, with, among other things, the ballot box as the great secular confessional, where even people of a deep religious faith can and indeed must be non-religious with a supposed spiritual and moral impunity. The second is the understanding that once a person, and especially an issue, particularly a religious one, such as the institution of marriage and the sanctity of life, enters the political realm, it is then considered off limits to all moral and especially religious consideration and input. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's, is the great rallying cry for some who attempt to religiously advocate the non-religious orientation of modern politics. However, noting the manner in which the Pharisees initially brought up the issue of the secular tax, they sought to trap Jesus, I often wonder if such a convenient misinterpretation would really be one given by Jesus, especially with his rather crafty suggestions in the face of such attempts at entrapment. After all, nothing with Jesus is ever that cut and dry. Being a follower of Christ means and includes being a good citizen. St. Peter advocates this in his epistle, giving specific instructions to respect those responsible for governing. And in his letter to the Romans, St. Paul teaches the same. And yes, while taxes may be somewhat excessive and the payment of them annoying, to say the very least, the Catechism of the Catholic Church nonetheless teaches submission to authority and co-responsibility for the common good make it morally obligatory to pay taxes, to exercise the right to vote, and to defend one's country. There is, however, as always with Christ, a catch. In dodging the Pharisees' attempts to entrap him with a phrase that includes "render to God the things that are God's," is not Jesus reminding us that while some things are Caesar's, all things are God's? While some things are due to the government, all things are due to God. While some things are out of the political realm, nothing is out of the spiritual, moral, and religious realm of God. Because in the end, as Peter reminds us, you must live as servants of God, because, as Paul reminds us, all authority that exists is established by God. Jesus has shown us the way, that all things are owed to God. And while Jesus was able to evade the scrutiny of the Pharisees, nowhere can we escape the scrutiny of God. While we render to Caesar what is Caesar's in the context and realm of Caesar, everyone, in every context, even that of Caesar, and even Caesar himself, must render to God the things that are God's. This makes politics and social involvement and political participation not a realm in which we are shielded from religious values, but rather a realm in which God's scrutiny to what is owed is at its most meticulous. I believe our founding fathers appreciated this and saw it as a great advantage to the nation they were founding, so much so that they acknowledged the importance of faith in God in the very founding documents and assured its protection in our Constitution. And I would note, it's the only system of moral values that is protected by our Constitution. Because, as Thomas Jefferson initially coined the phrase, separation of church and state is not meant to be a protection of the state from the church, but rather a protection of the church from the state. And this is borne out in our Constitution, in the so-called no religious test clause that we find in Article 6, Clause 3, which declares the senators and representatives and the members of the several state legislatures and all executive and judicial officers, both of the United States and of the several states, shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support this Constitution. But no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. Our founding fathers, perhaps without even realizing it, understood the true meaning of the words, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." Because in this clause, the Constitution requires loyalty to the Constitution, but in no way requires anyone to forsake their faith to obtain positions of civil responsibility and to maintain them. Our founders wanted the people to love their country. But in loving their country and carrying out their civic duty, to also, not instead of, to also be true to the faith they profess. Given that, I believe it is no accident that we hear this reading just a little over 2 weeks before our nation engages in one of the most contentious elections in modern history, if not all American history. It comes at a time in which we have seen the authority of government, nation, state, and local, exercised to various degrees in response to both a great animosity some in our society have to the current presidential administration, as well as in response to the health crisis of just the last few months. Our nation is at a crossroads, again, in which we must choose the direction we wish to see our nation proceed, as well as the spirit, character, nature, and moral fiber in which it will advance. As always, we as Catholics will have an important say, but one that must have a particular quality and character. To begin with, unlike other socio-political groups that stand out during these times of election, no single candidate or party has been able to box the Catholic vote in such a way as to assure its loyalty. This can be a good thing, in that no candidate or party has been able to predict us and take us for granted. On the other hand, it may indicate something far more ominous for us as Catholics. It could mean that for so many Catholics, politics takes a front seat to faith, and that the secular politics of our country has succeeded in neutralizing the Catholic vote, because we as Catholics have allowed the passions of our politics to divide us as a people of faith, to the point that we no longer have a strong influence and are neither a factor nor a force to be reckoned with in any election. This is particularly self-evident when we see people, voters and politicians, who claim to profess a Catholic faith while voting and supporting policies and candidates that directly oppose and contradict Catholic teaching, and in some cases do damage to the message and work of the Catholic Church in our country. As we all know, and when all is said and done, we do not need reminding, our bishops have regularly told us what are the absolute non-negotiables when it comes to Catholics voting in good conscience. No Catholic can in good conscience vote for a policy or a candidate who supports policies that are in violation of the sanctity of human life, especially innocent life in the womb, and are opposed to the sanctity of marriage as a permanent union between a man and a woman. However, this year, especially this year, two other issues have arisen that speak to our conscience as Catholics, and which we as Catholic voters cannot ignore, and must make sure that in our vote we are not in opposition to the teachings of the Catholic Church. Socialism, as a socio-political structure, has become very prominent as an issue and an alternative for the future of our country. It is important, therefore, to be reminded of the teaching of the Catholic Church on the effects of socialism to the family and to society, which has been consistent over 11 consecutive popes over the last 130 years, when Pope Leo XIII issued his landmark encyclical Rerum Novarum in 1891. Quote, "The idea that civil government should at its own discretion intrude into and pervade the family and the household is a great and pernicious error. It is right that extreme necessity be met by public aid, for this is not to deprive citizens of their rights, but justly and properly to safeguard and strengthen them. But the rulers of the state must go no further. Here, nature bids them stop. Paternal authority can be neither abolished nor absorbed by the state, for it has the same source as human life itself. The child takes its place in civil society not of its own right, but in its quality as a member of the family in which it is born. Socialism, therefore, in setting aside the parent and setting up a state supervision, act against natural justice and destroy the structure of the home. And such interference is not only unjust, but is quite certain to harass and disturb all classes of citizens and to subject them to odious and intolerable slavery. The sources of wealth would themselves run dry, for no one would have any interest in exerting his talents or his industry. And that ideal equality of which so much is said would in reality be the leveling down of all to the same condition of misery and dishonor. Thus it is clear that the main tenet of socialism, the community of goods, must be utterly rejected, since it only injures those whom it would seem meant to benefit, is directly contrary to the natural rights of mankind, and would introduce confusion and disorder to the Commonwealth. The first and most fundamental principle, therefore, if one would undertake to improve the condition of the masses, must be the inviolability of private property." End of quote. In his encyclical Quadragesimo Anno, 40 years after Rerum Novarum, Pope Pius XI states it even more plainly and clearly. If socialism, like all errors, contains some truth, it is based nevertheless on a theory of human society peculiar to itself and irreconcilable with true Christianity. Religious socialism, Christian socialism are contradictory terms. No one can be at the same time a good Catholic and a true socialist. End quote. The other issue that has arisen in this election, especially as a result of the current health crisis, an issue that we have particularly felt here in our city and have struggled with some success to undo in the previous weeks, are the violations of religious liberty by our civil authorities in the name of public health. As our own Archbishop has pointed out, and hopefully we all recognize, we of the Church, as St. Peter encourages us, have been more than good citizens in this matter, cooperative in ensuring the safety protocols to assist in combating the spread of coronavirus, in effect, rendering to Caesar that which is Caesar's. In return, state and city officials responded with draconian regulations aimed at targeting the life and worship of the Church, in violation of our religious rights protected by the First Amendment. I refer you to the Archbishop's homily on September 20th, which can be seen on YouTube in our Archdiocesan YouTube channel. September 20th of this year. A homily given on the very steps of this cathedral, broadcast via loudspeakers to the entire city of San Francisco. So bad did these excessive regulations get, just here in our city, that the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division issued a letter to the mayor to change city policies to be more in conformity with our rights to freely practice our faith under the protections of the First Amendment. Further, in the midst of this election, we have heard through public statements and hot microphones intentions to vote down a nominee to the Supreme Court simply because she is too Catholic, or deny the qualifications of other nominees to other courts because they belong to what some politicians call a sexist, extremist organization called the Knights of Columbus. We've heard threats to renew lawsuits against the Little Sisters of the Poor because they will not provide the health care plans for their employers, medical procedures that are extremely, profoundly sacrilegious. And what better opportunity is there than during a health crisis to order the closure of churches and synagogues and then prolong their reopening in order to marginalize and silence something that our founding fathers wanted present and protected in the life, thought, and culture of the United States as a moral influence to ensure the future and stability of our republic. As Catholics, we must rise up and stand firm against threats to religious liberty in our country and the exclusion of God in our society and its institutions. It is no accident that it is listed as the first of our freedoms in the Bill of Rights. It is the first line of defense of our other freedoms, or it will be the last holdout. Its fall will not be an isolated incident. If ever our religious freedoms fall, it will mean that our other freedoms will either have already fallen or will not be long in following. As Catholic people of faith, we have an opportunity in this election. An opportunity as Catholic voters to rise above the exaggerated hysteria and mean-spirit hyperbole designed to divide us as a people of faith and whip us into a frenzy. To rather be a people and a presence in our nation that above all keeps its unity, keeps its cool, keeps its head, and maintains a grip during a time of great fear, great tension, a growing hatred of our nation among some, and a civil disregard for the rights of others that has led to chaos in our streets and division throughout our beloved nation and life-threatening danger to many of its citizens. For the sake of our nation, and I would say the salvation of our souls, which will be held accountable for how we participate in this and any election, let us rise above the divisions of party and ideology as we cast our vote. Let us not think in terms of Republican or Democrat, of liberal or conservative, or even in terms of Trump or Biden. Rather, let us think in terms of Catholic or anti-Catholic, Christian or anti-Christian, religious liberty or religious suppression, socialism or freedom, hatred of our nation because of its imperfect history, or love for our country because of how far it has come in rising above its imperfections, to be more and more that shining city on a hill, always reaching to the greater promise of its initial founding. But most importantly, in casting our vote, let us not triangulate ourselves from our faith, but fulfilling the desire of our founders that faith and religion be a protected feature of our nation's progress, let us truly fulfill our duty in rendering to Caesar while also rendering to God. Always remembering that while some things belong to Caesar, all things belong to God.